Again, what a perfect day to celebrate. Have to take a deep breath after doing all that with the mask on. What a great day to celebrate the love that God has for us. God creates us in love, and in love, God calls us, and in love, God calls us to love one another. So it's a great day for us to celebrate all of that. I hope you were with us last week. Last week, Pastor David gave a great message on what it means to be called by God. Each and every one of us have been called by God, and we've been called into a relationship with God made possible through Jesus Christ. David shared that all of us are called to be saved, reconciled to God. We are also called to be sanctified. Sanctification is the process. I kind of call it the process of becoming more like Jesus. The process of experiencing the fullness of life that God has for us. One of my favorite passages is John 10:10, the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 10, where Jesus said, look, I've come so that you might have life, but not just life abundant or life to the fullest. Sanctification is that process of beginning to experience that fullness of life, and we do that through Jesus. And so all of us have been called into this relationship with God, and we've also been called to have as David shared just a little bit earlier, we're called to live a life of purpose and meaning, where our gifts and our passions come together so that we serve God and we serve the community, we serve the world. And if you are looking for something more in life, if you're living your life thinking, there's got to be more than this, and for many of us, we get to that place and we start thinking, there's just got to be more than, my job and even my family, as much as I love my family and the daily grind, there's got to be more. The good news is that there is more, because God has called us to the fullness of life, and where our gifts and our passions come together, and when we live that out in new and powerful ways, we experience all that fullness. And so David shared how important it is for us to think about who God has called us to be before we think about what God has called us to do. In David, the way that David talked about it, it's like who before do. Who has God called us to be? Because that's what we need to focus on first. And then out of that, we grow into what God has called us to do. Now, what I want to share is that I believe it is the same for the church. It's the same for the church. We are called to be something. We're called to be a community, a family of faith. We are called to be, and then out of that life, we are called to do, to have a very specific mission that has been given to us by Jesus. And so today, as we think about our calling, as maybe we reclaim our calling, let's think about who before do. Who has God called us to be? We can see that from the very first community of faith. We see just a great picture of who God has called us to be from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. And so this is the very early foundation of the church. These are people who have just been called by God, a large group of people who have just been called by God to come together as a community of faith. And this is the picture that we get. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together. They had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes. They ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So let's not focus on what they did. Let's focus on who they were. They have been called to be a family of faith. They've been called to be a community. And so they have gathered together really around God. They're devoted to worship and to teaching. They have gathered their lives around God. And so they are coming together to be a family. In many ways, God has always called us to be a family. You can go back into the Old Testament. God called Abraham and said, I'm going to give you a family. Before Abraham even had any kids. And he was advanced in years, and they'd never had any children. God said, I'm going to make you a family. I'm going to make you a community. And that became Israel. That became the people of God. That became, in time, the church. And so we were called to be a family somehow focused on and centered on God. They allowed the worship and the study. They allowed prayer to shape them. They used the life of Jesus as an example for their life together. And that life together was lived to the fullest. It was so powerful that it began to draw other people in. Because of how they loved God and because of how they loved others, they drew people in. It says the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. They weren't coming in because of great ministry and program. They were coming in because this community knew how to love one another. And they loved one another in real and tangible ways. One of the reasons that I am here today as a pastor, living into God's call in my life, is because there was a church, actually there were several, but there was a church that I grew up in that knew how to be the church. They knew how to gather together as a community around God, and they knew how to love one another, and they knew how to welcome other people into that community. My home church in Connecticut did a lot of good things. They did amazing outreach, and they had amazing, missions and service in the community, and I don't remember any of them. Well, that's not true. I remember a couple. But what I remember is who they were. Because you see, they were the people, they were the family of faith that welcomed me, accepted me, encouraged me, and loved me. They were the church that let kids be kids and the youth group be the youth group, if you know what I mean. I mean, our youth group, well, in some churches we would have gotten into trouble, but they allowed us to be the church. I shouldn't say this and give our youth group any ideas, but we had this whole bread making fundraiser, and at the end of the night, when the leftover bread dough that we have that we were not making into bread to sell ended up getting thrown on the walls to see if it would stick. They let the youth group be the youth group. They loved us for who we were and reminded us daily that God had created us and that God loved us and that, yes, God had called us. They were the people who let me stay in Sunday school when I didn't want to sit in worship. They were the people who let me teach Sunday school when I was a junior in high school. So my senior year, I was teaching third graders. You don't think that's scary? Let me tell you, we had fun. They let me sing in the adult choir when I was still a youth. They let me fill in on the bell choir when I was home on the holidays. They allowed me even to preach a few times when I heard a call to ministry. They were the ones who opened their homes to me and their hearts to me. They made sure that I knew that God loved me and that God had called me. I'm not standing here today because of the great programs that they had. I'm not standing here because they knew how to serve in the community. I'm standing here because they knew how to be a family of faith focused on God that can love others and who wants to welcome people at the table. That's what it means to be called the church. To be a community of love that cares for other people in real ways. A community that doesn't live for itself, but lives for others and welcomes others. I've been the pastor here at Faith Church for 12 years, and I have to tell you, one of the blessings that I celebrate and I have since I came here was that we somehow have figured out how to be the church, and that is not something to be taken for granted. We've learned how to love and love one another and live together with grace. I share this with my colleagues who are like, You've got to be kidding, Andy. And I was like, no, this is truth. I've been here for 12 years, and we have not dealt with any church-wide conflict or division. Have we been able to agree on every single decision we've ever made? Absolutely not. No, of course not. We have our different opinions, we have our different views, but we live together in grace. We give for one another. We're willing to consider others better than ourselves. And every time we do that, we grow into the likeness of Jesus. And we become more of who God calls us to be. We love gathering together, but we love to actually have people at the table with us. We see this all around us. We've made space for people. For example, we've made space for people in worship. You attend, the more modern worship setting. In case you don't know, we have a traditional worship setting at 8:15. We've allowed people to come together to worship in very different settings. And instead of saying, hey, you need to do it our way, we celebrate that we can do it in different ways. One of the most moving moments for me, I'll probably always remember this. It was just such a great moment, very simple, but there is a man who's attended here all of his life, an older gentleman who's been in leadership here, and he was attending Sunday school. He attends the first service and attends Sunday school, and he came out into the lobby, and he started seeing all these cars come in for the second service, and he saw all these young families coming into the church, and he saw me later in the week, and he said, Andy, all of these people were coming into the church. Like, I didn't know any of them. And I was almost waiting for, we really need to kind of be one church and figure out how to. What he said was, it was awesome. It was so good to see new people coming. I'm so glad that they feel welcomed and we have this service because we have the ability to bring people together in new and fresh ways to reach new people. We can live together without trying to change one another necessarily. I mean, we challenge one another to change and to grow, but we don't try to change people. I was talking to someone during the services and I said, we have lived through a very divisive year, 2 years, 4 years, very divisive. We're still living with that kind of antagonism for people who think differently than us. I'm very thankful that we have people who, let me just say, vote very differently and yet can come together to worship. We don't try to change one another as much as we say, we can celebrate who we are because we know that God loves us and we know that God has called us. And it's a challenge sometimes and we wrestle with one another, but God has called us to be the church. And so we sacrifice for one another. We consider others better than ourselves. And we love coming together as the people of God and we love making room for more people to join us. As great as our ministries are, and they're good, we have figured out how to welcome new people, even in the midst of a pandemic. One of the things that I think is amazing is that our online ministry has allowed us to reach out to more people. We've made room for more people to be able to gather with us and to share who we are. We've grown in our children and youth ministries, which at times puts a strain on our budget and our leaders and, yes, our facility. And we're all cramped for space, but we live together and we share together. We are a family of faith who knows how to put the love that God has for us into practice in our love for one another. We figured out how to be the church. And so, as the church, knowing who God's called us to be, can we now look at the calling of what God has called us to do? Can we reclaim our calling, a sense of purpose? There's been one very clear call to the church, a call given to us by Jesus, who before he ascended into heaven, said to the church that was gathered, the followers that were gathered, he said, I have one mission for you. Go and make disciples of Jesus Christ. We hear this in Matthew chapter 28, beginning at verse 18. Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples in all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. While the church is called to be a community, what we are called to do is make disciples. We are called to go and let people know that God has called you. Just as God has called us, God has called you. We are to share that message. God has called you to be in a relationship with himself through Jesus Christ. God has called you because God loves you and God cares for you and God has more for you. God has called you for salvation and God has called you for sanctification, for the living of life and life abundant. God has called you. We are called to go and share that calling, to go and make disciples. We are called to baptize them. Thank God we had a baptism today. And what's baptism? It's inviting someone into the family of God. It's inviting people to the table. Whether it's an infant, a youth, or an adult, we baptize, we bring people into the family of God. We are called to go and make disciples. That is our calling. Unfortunately, most churches in the United States have lost the call. 80% of all churches are either declining or have plateaued, which means they're not growing. It means they're not going and making disciples. It means they have forsaken the call. They're not living into the call that God has for them. They aren't welcoming new people into the family of God. They aren't loving God and others in ways that are so compelling and inspiring that it invites people in. 80% of churches are not living into the call of God. 16% of churches are growing. And that's great news. They're growing. They're growing by addition, which means they add a few people every year, which is not bad. Please hear that. That's a good thing. They're adding a few people every year, but they're not transforming their community. They're not transforming the world, which is what the early church did. The early church just didn't add a few people every year. They grew exponentially. They grew beyond their possibilities of what they even thought they could do. They were growing by multiplication. They were growing by reproducing themselves. The Apostle Paul would go out. He went from the church in Jerusalem. He went from the church in Antioch, and he went to new places, and he started new churches to reach all kinds of new people, because that's what Jesus called the church to do, to go to new places, go find new people, communicate the gospel in new ways so that they can hear that they are loved, so that they can be saved and sanctified, and so they can then share that calling. They can share that calling with others. 16% of churches are growing by addition, and that's great. But I have to ask myself, is there something more? Now, if you are at all familiar with math, we've gotten to 96%, which means there's still 4% of churches, 4% of churches who are growing like the early church. They are growing by multiplication, and they are figuring out how to reproduce themselves. They are churches that are planting churches. They are churches that are creating new communities of faith in new communities to draw new people who have the vision to go out and call new people. They're not just planting churches, they're planting churches that will plant churches. They're not just making disciples, they are making disciple makers. There's a difference. They are making disciple makers. Leaders who understand that we're called to raise up more leaders. They have reclaimed the call to go and make disciples in all places. And so I ask myself, and I want to ask us, what would it look like for Faith Church to be part of that 4%? What would it look like to not be content being part of the 16% that's growing, which is good, but to be part of the 4% that reclaims the call to go and make disciples? Not to be content staying here and waiting for the disciples or people who want to be disciples to come to us. What does it look like for us to go and make disciples? And to make disciples in all the world. Where might God call us to go? How is God going to call us to do that? How do we multiply? How do we reproduce ourselves? How do we start new things in new places? Who are the new people? Is God even calling us to this? I want to share with you today that I firmly believe, absolutely believe, that God is leading us to reclaim the call. I firmly believe God is saying, will you, Faith Church, be part of that 4% that won't be content just growing by adding a few people here and there, but want to grow exponentially and multiply and reproduce yourself to reach more people. I completely believe God is calling us to this mission, and I want to share with you why. Number one, we figured out how to be the church, and that is not a small thing. We know how to love one another, but in a way that makes room at the table to welcome more people in. That is not a small thing. That is a big thing, because you got to get that right before you can do anything else. And there is a passion for people that this congregation has had long before I got here. This congregation has had a passion for people. It built this location in our community to reach more people. We started a daycare to be able to reach more families. We started the Faith Center because we cared about the people who might not visit our church, but who might be in need in our community. We figured out how to have a passion for people and even to go new places to reach them. We figured out how to be the church, to love one another and to welcome people in. And that is no small step. We have figured out how to be the church. The second reason I firmly believe God is calling us to reclaim this vision is because we have vital ministries that can be reproduced in new places. And all of us have experienced that in the past year. Because when the pandemic hit and churches had to close, we very quickly went online. We took our worship service, think about it, we took our worship service, and now every week we are reproducing it in new places. There are people joining us online from all over Centre County, from all over the country. We have figured out how to take what we have and reproduce it in a new place, and we're impacting people. We're sharing what we have with new people. We also have an incredible children's ministry, and I know it's kind of, in this transition time because of COVID, but we have an amazing children's ministry. We have an amazing youth ministry. We have ministry for families. We have small group ministries that can be a model for new places. We have a discipleship pathway. Someone comes and says, hey, I want to follow Jesus. What do I do? We have a way that we can tangibly say, well, here's something you can do. You can take the 3 relationship assessment to kind of see where you are spiritually, you can grow in 3 relationships: a relationship with God, the church, and the world, because that's really what it's all about. And in each of those relationships, there are 5 rhythms that can help you strengthen that relationship. And you can take the assessment and you can look at your results, and we can give you the material and you can go through it and you can talk to people about how to grow in those rhythms and grow in those relationships, and we will walk through that with you. And if you want something more, if you do all of that and you say, you know what, I want to grow in my faith, then right now we're offering a grow class. You want to know how to grow in a relationship with God? Take that class. Sign up for it. There are also small groups. There's Sunday school. There are Bible studies. There are service opportunities. We have a program of ministry that can be easily reproduced and shared in new places. Everything that helps us be the church, we can duplicate. We can share. We can go into new places. And then the third reason that I firmly believe God is calling us to reclaim this calling is because God is raising up leaders among us. God is calling people from Faith Church to rise up and to step out in mission and ministry. If you were with us last year, you know that we had a youth ministry intern, Rick Methvin. And he's now in college to finish his undergrad, and he's getting a degree in ministry. Feels called by God to be in full-time ministry. Many of us got to know Rick. If you haven't, you can go back and listen to his sermon. You can find some of his devotions. One, he's upside down. Not because he's standing on his head, but because he couldn't quite figure out the iPhone thing. But I don't know about you. If you know Rick, you will share this with me. I would take Rick back as a leader in this church in a heartbeat. He's the kind of leader that we want. And I would love to see Rick come back and work with us to go to new places, to reach new people, and to share with them the message of Jesus. I'm excited today to not only share with you, but to have you actually see him live and in person. We are going to have a ministry intern this summer named Justin Freer. Justin is in his second year at Divinity School at Duke Divinity School. Go Duke. And we are actually very fortunate to have Justin with us. He's actually here today at this service. Stand up, Justin, just so people know where you are. They can all mob you afterwards. And I think do we have a picture of Justin and his fiance? I don't know. There we go. Sarah Anderson. They are getting married in 2022. And so Justin, she lives in Wisconsin for now, but Justin will be with us. You can sit down now, Justin. You don't have to keep standing up. We are excited to have Justin with us, and he's going to be doing a little bit of everything this summer. And what I appreciate is that Justin sought us out. He was looking for a vital, active church, larger church that's doing good work that he can learn from. And so he sought us out and said, hey, I want to learn from you. Now, I tried to talk Justin out of going into ministry. True story, I can share it later. Fortunately, he didn't listen to me. He listened to the calling that God had on his life. But what I know of Justin, which isn't very much, but what I know of him, I would take him back in a heartbeat to be a leader among Faith Church. If God is calling him to be part of what we're doing, then I would take him, done with seminary, I would say, please appoint him here so that he can help us go to new places to reach new people for Jesus Christ. God is literally bringing leaders to us. Beyond those who have risen up as interns, I am so excited that there have been people within the congregation who are just coming to Pastor David, coming to me saying, I feel God is calling me to ministry. It may not be a whole transformation of what they do in life. For some people, they really are evaluating that and wrestling with that. But God is calling them to step up, and they are feeling a sense of greater desire to be used by God. And they're asking, where do my gifts and my passions come together so that I can serve God? And in fact, last week I had 2 people come to me in the span of 2 hours and say, Andy, I feel like God is calling me to ministry. And I immediately got on the phone with Pastor David and I said, so we got to figure out like what to do here. And I'm like, God, what are you doing bringing us all these leaders? Like, we've already got an intern. Well, we had an intern last year. Now we have an intern this year. Now there are 2 more people. Like, God, what are we supposed to do with all these leaders? And I said that to God. Like, what are we supposed to do? And I'm not kidding. You know, in my head, I heard God say, really? You have to ask? I'm giving you leaders so that you can go and reclaim the call to make disciples. Because to go, you're going to need leaders to go, and then you're going to need leaders here. Because as you send out leaders, they're going to have to be people to take their place, and you need to raise up leaders. And so one of the prayers that we had a year ago was, God, we need to raise up leaders. And all of a sudden, God's raising up leaders, and I'm like, God, why are you doing this? And God's like, it's so you can reclaim the call to be part of that 4% that will grow by multiplication, that will figure out how to go to new places, to do new things, to reach new people, so that they can join you at the table of God. Because you see, when God calls us, God's going to equip us, and God's going to prepare us. Anytime there's a call by God, anytime God calls a church to reclaim a mission or to step out in faith, anytime God makes a call, God provides the direction and the resources that are needed. Sometimes they come ahead of time, sometimes they come during the call, but God always provides what's needed. When I was a pastor in Altoona, we were sensing a call to go and reach the children in our community. And so one Sunday I show up at the church. I've shared the story before, but I showed up at the church and we had red doors because I think every United Methodist church in Altoona has red doors. But anyway, we had red doors, and written in chalk along the door frame of the church were the names of children who had hung out there the day before. And so I'm looking at it thinking, well, I better wipe it all off before people come and complain about the vandalism. And so I got a wet rag and I'm just kind of wiping it off, and I heard God say, Andy, they're writing their names on the door of the church. I want their names written in the book of life. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And so I shared that with some of our leaders, and they said, well, let's go. Let's just open the doors and go sit on the sidewalk. Literally, that's what we did. We went and we sat on the sidewalk, and we began to build relationships. And it started an incredible vacation Bible school, which led into an after-school program, which 20-some years later is still going strong, with a food bank and a food pantry and feeding programs and a clothing bank, all out of this church because they were just willing to go. When I was the pastor in Lewisburg, I served a church that was the closest Protestant church to Bucknell University. We beat out 3 other churches by a half a block. Hey, I was happy. I could say, we're the closest Protestant church. And literally across the alley were 2, and down, I was like, hey, we're closer. God started bringing college students to us. They start showing up in worship. We make them part of the church. We figure out how to love them. College students are difficult, not because they're difficult, but they're transient. They're here, they're not here. What does it look like? And we just said, hey, whenever you're here, you're part of us, and we love you, and there's room at the table. And that meant starting a new worship service, because we wanted to reach college students, because God was bringing to us. And we heard God say, I have put a mission field called Bucknell University, and you're the closest church. What are you going to do? I'm bringing them to you. I'm preparing you. What are you going to do? We start a worship service to reach them. And out of that service came leaders who heard the call of God to go into mission and ministry throughout Pennsylvania and some throughout the world. And so then I come here and I think about Faith Church, and I look at our resources. I look at who we are. I look at how who we are has shaped what we do. And I'm seeing all these leaders, because it takes leaders to go to new places, and it takes leaders to fill the gaps as other people go. We offered the Grow class, and we have almost 40 people signed up for it. And I'm like, God, this doesn't happen in most churches. And God's like, I know. It's because I'm preparing you. I am preparing you to reclaim a calling, to go and make disciples. I'm giving you what you need. What will you do? What will you do? Will we be part of the 4% and go? We don't know what it's exactly going to look like. We don't know where God is at work in preparing people. And let me be clear, if God is raising up leaders, then God is also preparing people to hear the gospel. One of the sermons that I preached this past year that was so important for me was looking at the story on Pentecost. The Holy Spirit comes down upon the disciples. They are gathered in the upper room. They are filled. These leaders are filled, and they go. They literally go out onto the streets. But when they go out onto the streets, there are people from around the world who are gathered there who are ready to hear what they have to say. We know that because they hear the disciples and they said, "What are you saying? What are you talking about? What's going on?" They're asking questions because God has prepared them. They didn't say, we're out of here. We're not going to listen. No, God was preparing their hearts to hear. If God is raising up leaders and calling us to reclaim our calling to go and make disciples, then God is at work preparing people to hear the gospel. We don't know where yet. We don't know where. We don't know exactly what it will look like or what the process will look like or how to go. We know it will involve risk. We know it will call for sacrifice. But will we go? What will it look like for us to be faithful and leave the results to God? What will it look like for us to just take a step forward and trust God with the results? As we ask these questions, as we reflect on them as a church, I want to invite you to share your thoughts about Faith Church and your thoughts about this vision with us. And there's a way we're going to ask you to do that. It is through a survey called the Readiness 360. It's a short survey. It might take 15 or 20 minutes online. You can find the link at our digital bulletin. We are inviting everyone to take this because we believe that God will use this tool, will use this resource to help us see where we might need to continue to grow, how God might be shaping us, how God might be forming us, how we can use those strengths and grow in areas of weakness so that we can reclaim our calling. And this survey is for everyone. It's for everyone who's part of the church. Maybe you have been, a part of Faith Church from the beginning of your life. You are welcome to take that survey. Maybe you have been with us for the last 12 years. You are invited to take that survey. Maybe you've joined us during the pandemic. You are invited to take the survey. Maybe today's the first day and you're joining us online at home because the roads around here were pretty icy this morning. You are welcome to take the survey. It is open to everyone. It will ask for your names, but all results are anonymous. Your name is not connected up to the results that you share. All the information's online, and we invite you to help us reflect. It's one tangible way that you can help us reflect on what God is calling us to do and where God is calling us to go and how we can reclaim that calling in our lives. When I reflect on who we are, and when I look back at where God has led us, at least in the last 12 years, but I also look at who this church has been even before that, I firmly believe God is calling us to reclaim what it means to not just be the church, but to go and to make disciples. Let's not be content to sacrifice God's call on the altar of comfort. It'd be easy to just keep growing the way we are. But there's a part of me that says, is there something more? As good as this is, God, is there something more you have for us? Will we be content being part of the 16%, or will we say, God, we desire, our gifts and our passion is to be part of that 4% who will go and make disciples, who will understand that they are called to go and make disciples so that more people can hear that they, God, are loved by you and they have been called into a relationship with you through Jesus Christ, that they are called to be saved, that they're called to be sanctified, to become more like Jesus, and that they're called to serve you and the church and the world. I firmly believe that God is asking us today, what are you going to do? And I said, God, we're going to enter into a season of reflection, and we're going to pray, and we're going to challenge ourselves, and we're going to take seriously what it is that you're saying to us. And I believe that the faith of this congregation and our leaders are going to say, we want to be part of the 4%. God, we want to reclaim the call to go out and to share that everyone is called to know the goodness of God the way that we do, because God, you've changed our lives. You've made us who we are. And we're not content holding on to that. I invite you to be praying for the church, to be praying for our leaders. I invite you to please take the Readiness 360 and share with us your thoughts and your views so that we can reclaim God's call for us. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you for Faith Church. In my reflection for the last decade plus, God, I see a community that truly loves one another. Even through all of our differences, we've learned how to love one another, and we've learned how to welcome people to the table. God, we've learned how to be what you've called the church to be. And I thank you that we're already growing. And God, I pray that you would help us reclaim a call to now go. To not be content to just wait for people to come here, but God, that you would guide our steps as we seek to go to new places in new ways to reach new people that you are already preparing to hear about the good news of Jesus. God, I pray that through these next few weeks and months, you would make clear to us the direction that we are to go. I pray that you would give us confidence and boldness, but also humility and faith. That we would step out into, at times, risky and unknown scenarios so that we can be and do exactly what you've called us to. God, help us to reclaim our call to be the church of Jesus Christ. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.